This week we're going to look at seeding and planting techniques associated with ecosystem restoration projects. And so by the end of this week's material, as well as this short introductory lecture, I'm hoping that you'll understand some basic issues of seeding and planting and their associated techniques that are utilized in restoration projects, whether we're talking about rangeland restoration or forest restoration. And so, as we've seen and as you know from the material we've covered this semester, shrubs, grasses, sedges, forbs, as well as the trees themselves, if we're dealing in a forest ecosystem, or the main components of a rangeland or grassland system, are all vital parts of forest and rangeland ecosystems. And while many instances these forest or rangeland ecosystems are going to be supported or dominated by one, two, three, or a small subset of dominant species, such as ponderosa pine here in this picture, the forest floor and the understory and the regeneration layer is often dominated by dozens of species that comprise the understory of these ecosystems. And most of our restoration treatments are typically going to focus on these key primary species. So for instance, in a forest restoration project, we may be looking at restoring those key species. So last week when we looked at some of the issues with fire and oak regeneration issues in the eastern U.S., a lot of the restoration efforts in those forests are centered around enhancing advanced regeneration or existing natural regeneration of oak seedlings, but then also going in and planting oak seedlings in those forests. Same thing here in this picture. You know, we're dealing with a ponderosa pine forest here in northern Idaho, and we would want to focus primarily on the trees and regenerating those dominant species that are really important for these ecosystems we're trying to restore. But it's really also important to be thinking about the natural diversity and productivity of the understory plant community as well. And oftentimes we might use techniques and to enhance the growth and productivity of the understory in addition to these primary species that we're interested in regenerating. And so the reason we'd be interested in this, and again, let's look at a ponderosa pine forest here in northern Idaho. This understory component really provides a variety of ecosystem services, things that we've talked about here this semester. It provides important wildlife habitat, in this case, and for many conifer-driven and fire-dependent systems, where we have a natural disturbance regime where we have low intensity and low severity or mixed severity fires that go through. Having these grasses and other species and our small ponderosa pine regeneration, as you see in this picture, are going to be pretty important to help maintain forest structure. They're going to provide some of that fuel. It's not so much fuel that we're going to increase the severity of these fires, but it's really going to be something that these understory aspects are really going to help maintain the ecosystem health, the ecosystem integrity, and really help foster that structure and function, which is what we're after in terms of restoring ecosystems and moving them along a natural development trajectory. And then there's also the people side of the issue, right? And so we're looking at planting and seeding efforts as part of our restoration projects to really help provide aesthetic benefits. And so we may have wildflowers in some of these areas, or a diverse understory, or pollinators, or other types of ecosystem services that are going to be important, that are providing aesthetic benefits as well as what we might call provisioning ecosystem services, things that that we can take out of the forest itself or the rangeland ecosystem. So really focusing on this regeneration layer, how we augment that with seeding efforts, or planting, or using our restoration treatments to help natural regeneration are all going to be really important considerations of our restoration project. And so we can really help foster the development of this understory restoration by seeding and planting, either by broadcast seeding or hand seeding, or hand planting individual species that we want to see in our restored ecosystem. Okay, and so in some of these areas we might have native species that are still there, they're in the seed bank, and all we need is to open up the canopy of, say, a dense forest, or remove a lot of the pinyon juniper that's encroached into a rangeland, and then the natural processes can take over, and that restoration treatment of removing that material or doing some sort of chaining or a prescribed fire that we talked about in last week's materials, that's really going to help promote the growth of the understory species, and that really may be sufficient. And then there's going to be other instances where in other sites where we may lack those native species in their seeds. The seed bank may have been consumed in a high severity wildfire, for instance. And so it may be, in that instance, it may be necessary to reintroduce native plants either as seedlings or directly as seeds. Okay, and so one of the first things you're really going to want to focus in on, as with any kind of restoration plan or restoration treatment, is you're really going to want to have a good site assessment. And so you really should go out, you should conduct a survey of the site, the surrounding community, and as part of that step of the restoration process that we talked about earlier in the semester, as we work through developing our plan and doing our site inventory and identifying our reference systems and our targets for restoration, part of that is going to be surveying the surrounding community and developing a species list of key species that should be present in your site, in your restored site, and also looking at what species may already be there and what species may be absent. So those are ones that you might want to focus in on planting or enhancing as part of your specific restoration site plan. And then you also want to do a survey of the soil and the site potential. Understand kind of whether you have certain local climatic issues, things like frost pockets or other really dry exposed sites. So understanding the topography as well as the soil and water holding capacity, that's really going to help you understand the potential for the growth of these seeds or seedlings that you're putting into the ground to help enhance your restored site. And then if you do have areas that may be issues for specific species, then you might be able to target other species and select the appropriate tree or understory herbaceous species that's going to be the best for that specific site. Okay, so typically when you think about seed collection and seeding, and this is really going to be dependent on site, and there are only some general rules of thumb here that I want to share with you here in this introductory material. And that's, it's possible with careful planning, and it's critical to really understand the species life cycle, right? Understand when they germinate, what factors do they require to germinate. If you're dealing with a species like lodgepole pine or jack pine, or another conifer species that has serotinous cones, in other words, those cones that are tightly held and require certain temperatures for those cones to open up and release the seeds, typically following wildfire, you want to understand that, and you want to understand the requirements of the species and its life cycle to germinate and to become established on the site you're trying to restore. So it's really critical to understand that species life cycle. And then a lot of these species locally are going to be adapted to the climate. And so, for instance, it may not be appropriate to take a species from a southern part of the range, let's say going into Southern California and selecting seed from ponderosa pine there and bringing it here to northern Idaho or northern Montana or eastern Washington and planting that. There are genetic adaptations to local conditions that will make one species or one genetic stock of the same species less adaptable. When we think about elevation and moving species from a lower elevation to a higher elevation and vice versa, those things can also influence how successful a species is going to be as part of a restoration success. And so you really want to understand the life cycle and be careful about where you select the seed that you're going to use as part of your restoration plan. Okay, and so often it's best to stay within a specific area around your restoration site and try to collect seed from that area that's nearby your study area or within a distance of, say, 100 miles from the area you're trying to restore, because those species are going to be adapted to the climate conditions as well as the other aspects, the moisture and other aspects that are going to be important for germination and establishment. So, usually we'll require some type of permit from a land management agency if you're going to go out on Forest Service land or BLM land and collect seed to use as part of your restoration plan. But when you do that, you can directly collect it if you're in the right timing, or if you're dealing with large areas that you might be restoring and you know that you have a multi-year project. It might be early on as part of your restoration plan, creating and going out and collecting seed and putting that off-site to grow, and then harvesting seed over and over again from those individual plants from a nursery or from some sort of greenhouse that is going to allow you then to have a steady source of seed that's appropriate for the site you're trying to restore. Okay, you can also go out and buy commercial seeds, but you want to make sure that, as I mentioned, the seed is appropriate for your site. And as a general rule of thumb, it's usually best if that comes from a 100-mile radius of the restoration site. And another thing that's really important is to make sure that the commercial seed is really weed-free. And this is an important vector that you'll want to pay attention to in terms of invasive species and other weeds that you might be introducing as part of the seeding. And so once you have the seed and you're ready to move out and actually reseed as part of your restoration plan, it's really critical, again, to understand the life cycle of the species you're planting by seed or by seedling to help ensure successful germination and survival. So understand what the conditions are, what kind of vegetation competition you're going to have competing for light and other nutrients on that site. So it may be important for you to then, before you plant, to go out and use some sort of herbicide to control competing vegetation. Or it may be sufficient that you have, basically till that up or use a fire to go through a prescribed burn to make sure that you have the proper seedbed preparation and conditions. And so this is going to be really critical, and there's really no cookie cutter approach where a one-size-fits-all approach is going to be best here. It's really going to be determined by the conditions on the ground. What site, what species are you trying to regenerate and get established on your site that you're trying to restore, as well as where you are and within the range of those species. So you really need to understand the plants. You need to understand your system. As we mentioned from day one, this is really critical that you understand the ecology of the site you're trying to restore. And so there are lots of resources out there that you can rely on. Two that you can look at as far as establishment guidelines might be, one might be the USDA NRS Plant Materials Center, as well as the Native Plants Network, which is another website that if you just Google that, you'll be able to find, and there's a lot of regeneration information there. And then lastly, I think like any part of restoration, the last step and one of the most often overlooked, but one that's most critical, is that you really need to monitor the success of your seeding or planting. So you want to monitor that, and you want to look at how successful, what your success rate is, what your survival rates are, how well they're growing. If you do see things that are impacting the survival, making some effort to mitigate those conditions. And so you might need to protect the seeds. You also might need to, if you're dealing in areas such as many forest systems here in northern Idaho or Montana, or across the U.S. for that matter. It doesn't matter whether you're here in a Doug fir forest or whether you're back in the eastern part of the U.S. dealing with trying to regenerate oak in Ohio or other places in the Appalachians. You really do need to protect seedlings that you may be putting into the ground from grazing, either from elk here or deer or other small mammals that will graze on and preferentially browse the seedlings that you've put into the ground. So monitoring that, keeping track of how successful and what your survival is going to be critical as you move this through and as you move your restored site back into a more natural condition. So that's pretty much the introductory material that I want you to keep in mind, kind of as a general rule of thumb when we're thinking about planting and seeding vegetation as part of our restoration projects. I do have 2 guest lectures that really focus on rangeland restoration efforts using different types of seeding methods. One really focused on trying to get key components of the sagebrush steppe ecosystem restored in the Great Basin, and then a second guest lecture that really focuses on the importance of forbs and getting pollinators back in the site as another example of an important ecosystem service. And then we have several virtual field trips this week just to explore some techniques for planting and protecting seed and tree seedlings that are pretty common. These are not absolutely critical that you watch all the way through, but they do kind of give you some ideas about how you would go about planting tree seedlings as part of a restoration project, and then how you would protect them from browse. And then there's some really interesting use of technology that's really starting, in particularly the use of UAVs or drones for seeding. And so there are small little seed pods where they take seeds and they coat them with a material very similar to the kind of seed that you might get at Lowe's or Home Depot or at the hardware store to put out on your lawn in town, where it's that nice green coated seed that helps hold water and make sure that the seed is coated and protected. There are several companies now that are using these, and they're basically using larger drones to very quickly seed areas that are in remote parts, both in terms of tropical systems as well as here in the Pacific Northwest. So there's a very short video that kind of looks at the use of drones for seeding, and this is kind of the future of where some of this kind of technique probably will be moving as most of you move out into the real world as restoration professionals.